The gilded cages of European royalty were not built for imperfect heirs. Behind the magnificent portraits and the glittering ceremonies lay a dark, unwavering truth. A dynasty's survival depended on the illusion of flawless, divinely blessed blood. When a child was born who challenged this illusion, a prince or princess, with the distinctive features and developmental delays of what we now know as Down syndrome, the response was not compassion, but a swift and silent erasure. These children were not tragedies. In the eyes of their families, they were political catastrophes. Their lives became a secret war between the unyielding demands of power and the fragile whispers of humanity. A war fought in forgotten tower rooms, secluded country houses, and walled-off palace wings, where the only witnesses were paid for their silence. Consider the dawn breaking over Vienna in 1793, a light that never truly reached a small, mildewed room in the Habsburg palace. Here, a boy, his name, if anyone remembered it, was Ferdinand, clutched rough wool blankets. At 7 years old, he knew nothing of his birthright as a scion of Emperor Leopold II. He knew only the silence of his attendant, a woman who avoided his almond-shaped eyes, who left a bowl of cold porridge and retreated without a word. While his cousins learned Latin and diplomacy, Ferdinand's world was the dust motes dancing in a single shaft of light. He was a living ghost, a secret shame hidden away because his mind worked differently, a walking contradiction to the Habsburg myth of genetic superiority. His existence posed a dangerous question. If royal blood was so pure, so divinely appointed, how could it produce a child deemed unworthy of even being spoken to? This pattern of concealment was not unique to the Habsburgs. It was a royal playbook written in fear and shame. In the United Kingdom, Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, experienced a similar fate. For his first 4 years, he appeared in the official photographs, a cherubic face in a sailor suit amongst his siblings. But as he grew, the signs became impossible for the royal family to ignore. Seizures, learning difficulties, and features consistent with Down syndrome. By 1909, he vanished from public life. The official narrative dissolved into a quiet lie of poor health. He was relocated to Wood Farm, a secluded property on the Sandringham estate, in the care of his devoted nurse, Lala Bill. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, wrote in her diary of poor little Johnny, a child who lived in his own world, finding joy in collecting acorns and watching gardeners. His parents, however, maintained a regal distance, their visits scarce. When John died at age 13 from a severe seizure, Queen Mary called it a release and the greatest mercy. These words, echoed across centuries of royal correspondence, revealed a chilling worldview. A life that could not fulfill its dynastic duty was a life not worth living. Centuries earlier, in 1642, France, the same drama unfolded with even higher stakes. Queen Anne of Austria, wife of Louis XIII, gave birth to a son who preceded the future Sun King. Court history sanitized the event, recording only a weak infant who died after 43 days. But private letters between royal physicians, hidden for centuries in the Vatican's secret archives, tell a different story. They describe an infant with a flat nasal bridge, a single palmar crease, and a protruding tongue, features we now recognize as markers of Down syndrome, often accompanied by congenital heart defects. In an era that demanded blame for any misfortune, especially the death of a royal heir, the truth was too dangerous to utter. The child's wet nurse was interrogated, as if she were at fault. Anne of Austria embarked on pilgrimages, seeking answers from God for why she had been punished with a marked child. The court whispered of the king's sins or a celestial misalignment at conception. The one explanation that never surfaced was the simple, natural truth: human variation. This child was not a curse. He was different. But in the absolutist court of France, difference was tantamount to treason. The Romanovs of Russia, another dynasty obsessed with its own mystique, mastered the art of the archival disappearance. While the tragedy of Tsarevich Alexei's haemophilia is well known, a deeper secret lies buried. In 1882, Grand Duchess Vladimir Alexandrovna gave birth to a daughter. This child's name appears in no official genealogy. If she is mentioned at all, it is as an infant daughter, died young. Yet the empirical evidence of life is stubborn. Payroll records from the Alexander Palace show continuous payments to a specific set of servants assigned to a nursery in the East Wing for 16 years after her birth, far longer than required for an infant death. Letters between ladies in waiting hint at a girl who never learned to speak properly, who at 14 still cherished dolls intended for toddlers, and who would wander into the frozen gardens, laughing at snowflakes with a purity that terrified her family. When the revolution came in 1917, this forgotten Grand Duchess, a woman child unable to comprehend the chaos, simply vanished. Was she discovered by revolutionary soldiers in her sequestered nursery? Did a loyal servant spirit her away to a remote village? Or did her family, in their desperate flight, make a final, calculated decision about who was worth saving? The revolution erased her, just as her family had spent a lifetime doing. The driving force behind this centuries-long conspiracy of silence was a brutal political calculus. Royal children were not merely sons and daughters, they were political currency, symbols of dynastic strength, and pawns in international alliances. A prince who could not master statecraft, or a princess who might drool during a diplomatic dinner, was more than an embarrassment. They were a vulnerability that enemies could exploit. Their very existence undermined the foundational myth of monarchy. That blue blood conferred not just privilege, but perfection. A peasant family might integrate a child with differences into the rhythms of farm life, where simple tasks had value. But for royalty, there was no room for simplicity. The need to present an unbroken line of impeccable heirs, chosen by God, forced families to lock away their own flesh and blood, treating a genetic variation as the deepest of state secrets. The royal shame was not in the child's condition, but in the perceived failure of their divine bloodline, a failure they could not afford to admit. Concealment was only the beginning. For the royal children hidden from the world, a lifetime of quiet isolation unfolded within luxurious prisons. Their existence was not a single act of banishment, but a continuous state of being. A slow-burning erasure played out in remote country estates, sealed palace wings, and distant monasteries. While the world believed them dead or never knew they existed at all, these princes and princesses lived out their days in a strange, shadowy realm of privilege and profound neglect. Their lives were a paradox of immense wealth and emotional poverty, where every material need was met except the most fundamental, the need for love, recognition, and a place in the world. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, the system of royal confinement was institutionalized in a structure known as the kafes, or the cage, within Topkapi Palace. Here, potential heirs to the throne were imprisoned to prevent rebellion. For one unnamed son of Sultan Mehmed III, born with developmental delays, the cafes became a permanent home. Official records claimed his early death, but delivery logs tell a different story, detailing food and supplies delivered to a specific room for 23 years after his supposed passing. Guards reported strange, haunting sounds from the chamber, not the expected plotting or protests of a political prisoner, but the repetitive singing of simple songs and unexplained laughter at odd hours. When the room was finally opened during a succession crisis in 1617, a guard's memoir described an astonishing sight. An adult man with the mind of a child, surrounded by thousands of pieces of colored glass, meticulously arranged into vast, intricate patterns on the floor. For over 2 decades, he had been an unseen artist, creating breathtaking, ephemeral masterpieces for an audience of none, his humming the only soundtrack to a life of beautiful, solitary confinement. Meanwhile, in the opulent palaces of Bavaria, the Wittelsbach dynasty maintained their own version of the cafes. Princess Alexandra, born in 1826, was officially recorded as having died at age 3. Yet, the meticulous household accounts of Nymphenburg Palace tell a truth that the family tree does not, listing expenses for her care until 1851. She resided in what the servants called the Quiet Wing, a gilded annex of silence. A governess's diary, donated to the Bavarian State Library a century later, paints a poignant picture of Alexandra's life. It describes teaching a 25-year-old woman the most basic of tasks: how to dress herself, how to use a spoon, how to recognize letters she would never combine into words. Yet, between the lines of duty, a genuine tenderness emerges. The governess wrote of Alexandra's profound love for her pet canaries, how she would sit for hours in perfect, contented stillness, listening to their songs. Hers was a life of simple, sensory joys, deemed insufficient for a princess but enough for a human soul. When she died, her body was interred in an unmarked section of the royal crypt, a final, official denial of the quarter century she had spent in the Quiet Wing. For the royal families of the Iberian Peninsula, the preferred sanctuaries for secrets were often the cloistered halls of convents. In Portugal, King John V faced a dilemma with the birth of his daughter, Infanta Maria Francisca, in 1734. The court painter, John Ranke, was immediately commissioned for an official portrait, but he fled the country abruptly, his sketches destroyed. Years later, on his deathbed, He confessed he could not paint the infant's features in a way that would satisfy the king. "How do you paint innocence itself?" he lamented. "When innocence is not what power demands." Maria Francisca was placed in the convent of Santos Novo in Lisbon. The nuns who became her true family left records of a child who found purpose in simplicity, helping to fold altar cloths and feed the convent's cats, her spirit finding solace in the rhythmic rituals of monastic life. She sang along to prayers, a joyful, wordless noise that echoed in the sacred halls. When she died of fever at age 11, the nuns requested to bury her in their own cemetery. The royal approval was granted with unseemly haste. Her grave marker reads only, "God's child," a stark, anonymous epitaph for a princess whose name was erased because her being challenged the demands of power. Perhaps one of the most elaborate fictions was constructed by the Danish royal family for Prince Gustav, born in 1803. Rather than hide him away in a single location, they set him in constant, calculated motion. The public was told that Prince Gustav suffered from a delicate nervous constitution that required constant travel for his health. In reality, he was shuttled between remote royal properties every few months, a nomadic prisoner never allowed to stay long enough for local populations to notice his differences. His tutors were, in fact, minders who submitted falsified reports to the court about his progress in advanced studies, while in reality, they were patiently teaching him the most fundamental life skills. The private letters of one tutor, Hans Eriksson, reveal a man torn between his duty to the charade and a growing revolutionary understanding of his charge. Eriksson wrote of Gustav's unique and unappreciated gifts: a perfect memory for every person he met, an uncanny ability to predict weather changes days in advance, and a strange, intuitive gift for detecting falsehood. "Perhaps we measure intelligence too narrowly," Eriksson dared to write. "The prince understands things I do not, sees patterns I cannot perceive. Who truly has the deficit, him or those of us who cannot enter his world?" This profound insight found no purchase in the Danish court. When Gustav died at 31, likely from a heart condition common in Down syndrome, his death was announced as occurring in Italy. His body was returned to Denmark under cover of darkness and buried before dawn, his entire existence reduced to a single, elegant line in the royal genealogy, a lie written in ink to erase a life lived in shadows. Within these varied settings, the Ottoman cage, the Bavarian wing, the Portuguese convent, and the Danish itinerary, the lives of these hidden royals shared a common thread. They were lives of profound contradiction, surrounded by luxury yet deprived of liberty, their every physical need met while their emotional and social selves withered. They developed their own rich inner worlds, the Ottoman prince with his glass mosaics, Alexandra with her canaries, Maria Francisca with her wordless hymns, and Gustav with his deep connection to nature. These were not empty existences, but ones filled with their own meaning and beauty, unseen and unvalued by the world outside their walls. They were the living ghosts of their dynasties, their laughter and their silence a constant, unheeded reproach to the families that had chosen bloodline over blood. The official histories, written by the victors and the powerful, sought to consign these royal children to absolute oblivion. But history has a way of preserving truth in the margins, in the overlooked details, and in the courage of those who refuse to let these lives be completely erased. The story of the hidden royals is also a story of detection, a piecing together of a fragmented narrative from charred portraits, coded diaries, secreted medical notes, and the testimonies of commoners who risked everything to bear witness. These fragments form an archive of absence, a collection of evidence that defies the official silence and shouts the truth from the shadows where it was forced to reside. In Prussia, the most poignant evidence was systematically destroyed, yet its memory was preserved by a woman of unwavering devotion. Prince Waldemar, born in 1889 to Kaiser Wilhelm II's sister, was hidden away like so many others. But his nurse, Emma Müller, defied the family's shame. Using her own wages, she commissioned a local artist to paint the prince's portrait on each of his birthdays. For 17 years, she accumulated a visual chronicle of a boy growing into a man, his distinctive features rendered not as a flaw, but with dignity and profound care. After his death in 1906, Emma, perhaps hoping to force a moment of recognition, tried to present these portraits to his mother. They were not merely refused, they were burned in front of her, a final, brutal act of erasure. Undeterred, Emma spent her remaining years writing letters to newspapers, determined to tell Waldemar's story. No publication would dare print them. Discovered among her belongings after her own death, these letters painted a vivid picture of a young man who loved the sound of trains, could identify every bird by its song, and possessed an eidetic memory for music. He was not less than, she wrote, again and again. He was different than, and different in God's eyes is not wrong. Emma's words and her lost portrait stand as a testament to one woman's rebellion against the cold machinery of royal denial. From the very heart of the Spanish Habsburg court, a physician dared to voice a similar heresy and paid the ultimate price. Dr. Diego Mateo Zapata, writing in 1693, was tasked with examining a princess whose name was literally scratched from the record. His clinical notes described her small stature, difficulty swallowing, and profound developmental delays. But he also recorded something extraordinary: her boundless affection, her desire to embrace everyone she met, and her pure, unadulterated joy at music and dancing, even if she could not keep the rhythm. Zapata ventured a dangerous conclusion in his private notes, suggesting that such children were not divine curses or punishments for familial sin, but simply examples of God's mysterious variety. This challenge to the dogma of royal perfection was a fatal one. Zapata was eventually accused of heresy and burned by the Inquisition. Fearing for his work, he had hidden his most sensitive notes in a false bottom of a medical text, where they lay undisturbed, a secret within a secret, until their accidental discovery in 1954. His words, preserved across centuries, provide not just a medical account, but a moral one, condemning the cruelty of the very court he served. Sometimes, the truth was preserved not by defiance, but by the quiet, meticulous record-keeping of religious orders. In the case of the Habsburgs, the fate of one archduke, born in 1868, was uncovered through a midwife's diary discovered during the chaos of World War II. The child, a son of Archduke Karl Ludwig, was declared stillborn to his grieving mother. The midwife's diary, however, recorded a live birth of an infant, with features that made Emperor Franz Joseph himself recoil. The newborn was taken away, and the mother was told he had died. The midwife, paid handsomely for her silence, thought she would never see him again. Years later, she was called to a remote monastery outside Vienna to treat a sick child. There, she recognized the boy immediately. The monks, unaware of his true identity, called him Felix, meaning happy, for his radiant and joyful nature despite his limitations. They reported he lived among them for 12 years, helping with simple chores and beloved by all who saw in his innocence a reflection of holiness. When Felix died of scarlet fever in 1880, the abbot wrote in the monastery record, "Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him better than the world ever could." This entry, juxtaposed with the midwife's testimony, reveals a life saved not by his family, but by the compassion of strangers. His royal blood meaningless next to the simple virtue of a happy life. Even in the face of revolution and regime change, the evidence persisted. For the Romanovs, the truth of their hidden Grand Duchess was not in public documents, but in the dry, bureaucratic records of palace administration. The payroll sheets for the Alexander Palace's staff, examined by historians long after the dynasty had fallen, provided irrefutable proof. They showed continuous, specific salaries paid to a team of nursemaids, laundresses, and cooks assigned to a nursery in the East Wing for 16 years after the Grand Duchess's supposed infancy death. These financial records, untouched by the need for public propaganda, told a stark, numerical truth. A child requires care, and care requires staff. The money trail did not lie, outlining the ghost of a life through rubles and kopecks. Similarly, in Norway, which had only recently regained its independence, the secret of Princess Ragnhild was exposed not by its own keepers, but by its invaders. The princess, born in 1912, officially lived for only 3 days. Unofficially, she lived for 8 years in a Swiss medical facility. The facility's detailed records, which documented a child with mongoloid features who showed extraordinary affection, were seized by the Nazis in 1940 and later recovered by the Allies, becoming an unintended and ironic archive that preserved the very life her family had tried to conceal. These fragments, a nurse's letters, a physician's hidden notes, a midwife's diary, a monastery's chronicle, and cold payroll ledgers form a patchwork history that triumphs over intentional silence. They are testaments to the fact that while power can control the official narrative, it cannot completely extinguish the truth. The witnesses, the Emmas, the Diegos, the unnamed midwives and monks ensured that these children would not be entirely forgotten. They proved that the most damning evidence against the cruelty of the past is often found not in the grand pronouncements of kings, but in the quiet, stubborn persistence of human testimony, refusing to let the forgotten remain so. The 20th century dawned, bringing with it seismic shifts in medicine, politics, and social conscience. Yet the old royal instincts for concealment died hard. The journey from the shadowy secrecy of the Habsburg Towers to even hesitant public acknowledgement was a slow and painful one, marked by the darkest chapter in human history and the first, fragile cracks in the walls of royal denial. The story of these children in the modern era is no longer one of uniform silence, but a complex tapestry of continued shame, impossible moral choices, and a gradual, reluctant awakening to the idea that difference did not have to mean disappearance. The rise of the Nazi regime in Germany presented a horrifying new dilemma for royal families with hidden relatives. The state-sponsored Action T4 euthanasia program, which systematically murdered individuals with physical and intellectual disabilities, turned a private shame into a potential death sentence. For Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, born in 1915 to Crown Prince Wilhelm, the world had seemingly evolved. Her parents had placed her in a specialized institution where she received an education tailored to her abilities, learning to read simple texts and play the piano. But with the Nazis in power, her very existence was now illegal. Her family, once concerned with secrecy, was now forced to act to save her life. Historical records suggest that in a desperate and clandestine operation, Alexandrine was smuggled into neutral Switzerland, where she lived under an assumed name. She would eventually die in 1980, a woman who had outlived the very empire that bore her. Her survival, a silent rebuke to the genocidal ideology that had forced her into a second exile. This period forced a grim realization: the attitudes that royal families had helped perpetuate that disabled lives were less valuable, that had been taken to their logical, monstrous conclusion by the state. In the post-war rubble, as Europe confronted the horrors of the Holocaust, a profound shift in public consciousness began, slowly permeating even the most traditional institutions. The first, tentative breaks with centuries of tradition were almost imperceptible. When Prince John of Luxembourg was born with Down syndrome in 1957, his family made a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. They did not announce his death. They did not hide him completely. They acknowledged, in carefully worded statements, that he existed, that he was their son and brother, and that he lived in a special care facility. It was a revolutionary crack in the facade of absolute denial. It was not full acceptance, he was still kept from public view, but it was an admission of existence, a first step away from total erasure. This slow dawn was further illuminated by Spain's modern Bourbon dynasty. In a definitive break with the infamous practices of their Habsburg predecessors, King Juan Carlos's family publicly acknowledged in the 1970 seconds that his nephew had been born with Down syndrome. The child appeared in family photographs and attended select public events. He was spoken of with affection, not as a shameful secret, but as a beloved family member. This public integration was a watershed moment, highlighting just how recently such basic human recognition had been denied. It demonstrated that the monarchy could, if it chose, use its immense platform not to hide imperfection, but to model a new kind of inclusion. Yet, the old patterns persisted, modernized by advanced medicine and stringent privacy laws. The development of prenatal testing in the late 20th century created a new, silent frontier in this long history. It is widely speculated that some royal families, upon receiving a Down syndrome diagnosis, have chosen to terminate pregnancies, adding another, even more private layer to the archive of absence. For those who choose to continue the pregnancy, the response is typically one of extreme discretion, a far cry from the Spanish example. The children are provided with the best modern care and support, but their lives are often shielded from the media spotlight, a compromise between ancient shame and modern compassion. The pressure for royal heirs to be perfect, or to project an image of perfection, remains a powerful unspoken force. The legacy of the forgotten royals forces a difficult moral accounting. Were these royal families simply products of their time, following prevailing medical and social advice that labeled their children mongoloid idiots and recommended institutionalization? Or do they represent one of monarchy's greatest moral failures, the systematic denial of humanity to their most vulnerable members, an act of betrayal from those who should have been their fiercest protectors? The answer lies somewhere in between. Royal families did not invent societal prejudice, but their immense power and their foundational myth of genetic superiority meant they were uniquely positioned to challenge it. And yet, for centuries, they overwhelmingly chose to perpetuate it. The true tragedy, echoed from the Habsburg Tower Room to the modern private clinic, is the incalculable cost of this secrecy. It cost parents the opportunity to love their children openly, forcing them to see a part of their own flesh and blood as a shameful secret. It cost siblings the chance to develop empathy, instead reinforcing a dangerous belief in their own superior breeding. And most of all, it cost the children themselves, who, even when provided with material comfort, lived lives of profound isolation, often understanding on some level that they were a source of shame. The story of these children is less about Down syndrome itself and more about the corrupting nature of power, a power so fragile it could not withstand the simple, beautiful reality of human variation. Today, the ghosts of those hidden princes and princesses remain. They lie in unmarked graves and forgotten corners of crypts, their names erased, their faces destroyed. Yet, they lived. They breathed, they laughed, they created art in secret rooms, and they found joy in the song of a bird. In their silence, they speak volumes about what happens when bloodline matters more than blood, and when the fear of imperfection becomes a greater monster than any imagined defect. Their stories are a permanent reminder that the measure of any civilization, royal or republican, is not found in its crown jewels or its palaces, but in how it treats those who are different and in the courage it takes to choose remembrance over the easier path of forgetting. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the hidden corridors of history. If you were moved by these forgotten stories, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of history's deepest secrets. We are connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past.